Hello, everyone. You'll be able to hear me okay? Awesome. Thanks for taking the time. My name is Hemant Mohan. I'm a Senior Business Development Manager with the Worldwide Strategic Alliances Group here at AWS. I have the distinguished pleasure of joining Mike Massimi, who's the Global Principal with IBM Security Services, and then Abhay Raman, Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer at Sun Life. So AWS and IBM are partnering in a big way. There are three core areas that IBM and AWS partner today. On the consulting side, there's a global partnership that helps customers bring their hybrid and AI workloads to AWS. On the IBM software side, we have over 30 IBM products on the AWS marketplace today. And then, as some of you may have heard, we recently announced a strategic collaboration agreement with IBM that would see IBM bringing 19 of their core products as SaaS offerings on AWS. These are exciting times. It helps our customers achieve faster time to value. And all the joint investments we are making with IBM are going to be super, super, super important for our joint customers. And finally, the third pillar of a partnership is around ROSA, Red Hat. So today, customers can adopt a fully managed Red Hat OpenShift service on AWS. Again, helping customers achieve faster time to value through the adoption of Red Hat OpenShift on AWS. So with that, I want to invite Mike and Abhay on stage to walk us through the rest of the presentation. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Aman. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Massimi, and I'm going to talk a little bit about IBM and AWS's partnership, a little bit more detail in what Hemant was talking about, and then Abhay's going to take us through some lessons learned, real-world lessons learned as it relates to cloud security. So Hemant really covered some of the competency capabilities. IBM, by the numbers, we've made an investment as it relates to the amount of certified personnel that's required for us to have a global capability around these competencies. We're one of the only GSI organizations out there in the marketplace today with that extensive competency coverage, which we're very proud of. IBM Security, about 8,000 people, 8 security operations centers globally, so we have the competency for managed security services provider, and our consulting capabilities. That dovetails very nicely with the ISV capabilities from our software brethren. So we have soup to nuts, both the IBM capabilities on software and services, and part of that, from a services perspective, is the agnostic capabilities to represent third-party products. So it's not just IBM Security software, it's an ecosystem of capabilities, which ties into some of the messaging here that you're going to hear from Abhi as it relates to partnerships. So from a client benefits perspective, because we have the competencies, because we have the certifications in place, we're going to make it easy for clients, right? We're going to make it easy in the fact that the marketplace is going to be available to buy down for EDPs, and that's what customers are looking to do. And that's going to apply to our software products, okay? Doesn't apply to the services. We're also going to make sure that any customer that's bringing a software license into the environment can do so in a BYOL type of environment. And because we have the integrations, because we have the deployment capabilities, everything is going to be seamless for a customer to bring those technologies to bear. And then, one of the things we just, as it relates to the marketplace, all products and services, that can be available, will be available via the marketplace as we're onboarding those solutions. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to touch on was the cloud security services model. The model itself is a shared model, and that's something that a lot of clients get stuck on, and that we're seeing. AWS has phenomenal security for their infrastructure, but it's only going to be what they're responsible for, is the infrastructure. Where the data resides, who has access to that data, is going to be the responsibility of the client, okay? Now there's tools out there in the marketplace, third-party tools, cloud-native controls. These are great tools that AWS provides. Somebody needs to make sense of those. And that's what a GSI like IBM Security Services does. So we look at it from a perspective of what security can you depend on from AWS, what security capabilities can you utilize from their cloud native controls, and ultimately what third-party products could you utilize. Ultimately, it's creating that flexibility, something that's going to work within a hybrid cloud environment, because lo and behold, most customers are going to have a dependency on multiple cloud providers, and making sure that it works for everybody. So when we talk about partnership, when we talk about the trusted sort of landscape that's required in order to make this happen, because there's a lot of different moving parts here, we want to hear real world stories, and that's why we have Abhi Raman here, right? He's our CISO from Sun Life. Abhi, can you take us through, some of your experiences?
Sure. I never thought this would work, but what I thought I'd cover today is a couple of things. We all have numerous partnerships. We all have various vendors we're going to work with. I mean, in this situation itself, we work with AWS, we work with IBM. We have 15,000 other products in the middle there. So then you put yourself in your client's shoes if you're a client, or you put yourself in sort of my shoes, and you look at it and you go, how do I establish a strong enough partnership for when it's always great when you sign the contract, it's always great for the first little while. How do you make sure that it's sustainable? How do you make sure that, when you actually do have an issue, you have the ability to appropriately escalate, you have the ability to have that trust so that the vendor realizes what you're going through at the same time, and you're just not a number in the process. So the approach, we all have third-party programs, vendor programs. We all assess risk. We all stack them into various categories, and from our perspective, we have sort of 3 buckets we put our vendors into. We have critical vendors, and these would be things where we have very high switching costs. This is really hard for us to leave one and go to another, right? And we try to establish a shared risk model as much as possible. We also, do some co-evaluation and collaborate on business outcomes and things like that, which is great to read in terms of a third-party risk program. But the question then becomes, how do you actually do it? Right? How do you have skin in the game in both places? How do you make sure that you can actually execute on, your critical suppliers? When we look at sort of significant ones, there are high switching costs again. We have performance outcomes and various things. So when you look at, I don't want to go through all 3 of them, but and the tactical ones are just that, high volume relationships. You can switch out; it's not a problem, etc. We want to have a good portfolio of our third parties in all of these various buckets, and some of them are just going to be more important to us than the others, just because of the nature of the involvement in our business. So then when you look at how do you establish trust across the board for those types of suppliers and the others as well, has always been around, it's not just the contract. How do you understand where they're going to be? And I think Kurt at the keynote mentioned something that's kind of stuck with me, which was I want to be where the puck is going to be as opposed to where it is today. So how do you understand where your vendor is coming from in terms of their strategy? How is that going to create a good enough marketplace for you? How is that going to help your strategy going forward? Do they have sufficient context with respect to what you're trying to do so that they can also influence some of that internal strategy? I think those are the kinds of conversations you need to have with the vendors that support large portions of your business or are big partners to you. You need to figure out a way to manage the risk across the board between the two. And an interesting thing that we did in the context of risk and operations has been, we always found that while we have processes established with large vendors, we never really tested them out in terms of tabletops, in terms of incident response plans, in terms of walking through that process. Last year we did one with AWS where we went through, what would happen if our databases came down, or somebody had malware in there, or we got phished, or we lost the encryption keys, or something happened. Like, what would we do really? And when you look at all of the recommendations that came out through that, we had 27 or 28 of them. We learned our teams on the other side, so the AWS teams, had a lot of learning to do. We had a bunch of learning to do. We needed to have turned on other services. They needed to understand how, who's going to call them for which service, what type of output we're going to analyze and how, amongst other things, right? So, and that was really telling to us. And I would really recommend, other sort of clients to go through that exercise, because what it gives you on a regular basis is it gives you the opportunity to improve your incident response processes. Because you can put all of the various relationship bits and bobs together, but it's only when you have an issue that you need to figure out how you're going to escalate. And people change. People move jobs, roles change, products change, our business changes over a little while. So you need to do this on a regular basis. Just the way we do sort of breach response simulations, we do tabletops around that. For some of the large platform products, we need to do incident response simulations on a regular basis. Put it in the contract if you have to, but sometimes it's better to build a good enough relationship with your vendor partners to be able to execute on those. And I firmly believe that everybody should do it. I also believe that it's something that I will be doing on a regular basis with some of our larger partners. When we talk about communication and information sharing, we tend to establish processes when we sign a contract or we enter into a relationship, but we don't follow through, right? Because things get busy, people get busy, some people change, and then you just kind of drift apart. It's really important to enter into some sort of a regular cadence with respect to some of these things, to one, enable both parties to have enough context with that relationship across all levels. So one of the things that we've been doing is to get sort of my team at various levels related to our vendor partners at various levels. So the engineers know the engineers, and the executives know the executives, and that sort of stuff. What that helps us do is quickly establish context in case there's a situation, or we need to try something else, or there needs to be more effort put into something, etc. And it takes a while to get that cadence going. And you tend to see that not as a transactional step, but as something you just invest in. And both parties need to invest in it. Otherwise, it's just not something, we had an interesting conversation at one point with our executive team around, why we need to build these types of relationship, because otherwise you're just, a client in a lineup of a whole bunch, and you just kind of sequence it through that process. And as much as our clients don't want to be in that situation, so our account teams spend a ton of time, with our insurance sponsors and clients and things like that to build those tight relationships, we should be doing the same thing with respect to our platform relationships. And that's how we see it. Top management support is really important. So for example, I would have a strong relationship with the AWS leadership. I would have a strong relationship with, the IBM leadership and most of our key vendors. What that helps us do, we don't see each other very often, but what we do through that process is we end up in ensuring that we have enough context about the relationship, what's good, what's bad, what our strategies are, and that allows them to also invest appropriately in making sure our mutual needs are met. So I think those are sort of what we have found through trial and experience as being some good tenets of strong partnership and growth. And I'm sure there are others, but these are some things that we've been able to go through and identify and actually act on.
That's great, Abhi. Can you talk a little bit more about how a vendor would build trust with you? Does that happen over time? Is that only by the executive team? Is that the entire organization?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you an example with the stuff we do with IBM, right? And so I have a relationship with your GM for security. We have I sit on their customer advisory board. We've had a very strong relationship over the time. I mean, there have been hiccups. There are hiccups in any relationship. Hell, sometimes I don't load the dishwasher and there's a hiccup, right? So, and then we have relationships at various levels. So my engineering team meets with their engineering teams. The analysts meet with the analysts. Our response teams interact with the response teams. So, what happens through that process is even though there's a process to be followed in case there is a situation, or you want to learn something, you built a personal relationship, so people understand where you're coming from in terms of context. And especially at the senior level, I find that context is very useful. So, if we did have a situation, I picked up the phone and I called, they know exactly where I'm coming from. That helps solve the problem quicker. Because even if we didn't have the relationship, I'm pretty sure people will mobilize and work on things. But having the relationship gives it that sort of empathy in terms of that relationship, which I think is really important, and it makes for a more pleasant experience on both sides. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's very insightful to hear it from you as a CISO, how this works, because it's easy for us, be that AWS or IBM or all these vendors that are here in this room, we're making tools, right? We're hoping for outcomes, right? But it's really a partnership, an ecosystem that we need to work together, and working with you as the customer in order to do that.
And you make a good point. Some things that I also feel I think vendors could do more, or some do better and some don't, is to make sure that your clients are well aware of your strategy going forward. What ends up happening is you enter into the relationship, and then you end up, your mind stops at the point of that relationship. You look at strategy, you look at product, you look at what types of requirements and capabilities it helps solve for, and then you stop, right? And then it becomes operations, and you never think about, so where are they going? Where are they going to be 3 years from now? Does it line up with where we want them to be 3 years from now? Is it a fit, etc.? And then it comes time for renewal. Then you look at it and you go, oh my God, there's such a big gap. Then you look for other tools and products. And that what ends up happening is, it's shame on us too, because you end up proliferating so many different products, and at some point it becomes really hard to manage, right? So while I'm not saying one platform is the best solution, it needs to be manageable in the context of things. And I think we owe it to ourselves collectively to make sure each other is relatively well informed about where we think we need to go from a business standpoint, or where we are considering going. And I understand it changes, and you need to have that dialogue. At least it gives you something to talk about. I used to have somebody I used to work for before, and he had all his relationships organized into various buckets. And he would tell me, periodically I would send these people this sort of an article. How did you remember doing that? He said, I don't remember any of this. I actually put it in a spreadsheet. And I had my assistant tell me when I should be sending something to somebody. And I just send it. And it would create some conversation, and maybe we'll have a little bit of a chat and things like that. But what it really did was somehow find a way to keep that conversation going. And I think, you need to find a good balance. Everybody's not the same. Some people you'll quickly get into the habit of doing that. Some other people you'll never do it. But you need to find a way to make it work for professional reasons more so than anything else.
I think it's great. So contextual awareness across the board within the partnership community, right? Driving outcomes.
Yeah, totally. I've a little time left, and if I was to leave you with two things through this, one, how you establish the relationships across the board is really important. So you get sufficient context shared. So it's one piece. The second piece is figure out a way to do those tabletops, because you'll learn so much from that experience. I guarantee you it'll be valuable, and you'll know stuff that you didn't know before. I don't know if anybody else has any questions.
I think we're out of time. Thank you, Avi.
My pleasure. Take care, guys.